On January 20th, President Trump passed an executive order which stated that the government recognizes two genders, male and female. I was reading last night that a poll that said that issue, that executive order, is President Trump's most popular issue. It's the item on which the strongest majority of people approve of him so far. In part, I think, because it's seen to be part of a fight against transgender ideology that many people have been talking about. But I also understand that President Trump's executive order has caused disruption in research. And we're going to talk about that disruption together. That'll be our main topic today. I just wonder if we can just start just in a word. How serious is the disruption caused by research, caused to research by this executive order? Just briefly, we'll come back to it, but just start us off with a teaser, if you would.
Yeah, I would say two things quickly. One is that it has caused a lot of people very quickly to scramble to sort of scrub their papers. In fact, and part of, I don't know if it was exactly part of the executive order, but it was part of a related sort of suite of orders and sort of rulings, if you will, that researchers who use certain language, including language that you would use to describe, people who identify as trans and what have you like that, had to withdraw any manuscripts that were under consideration. And that to me, at a high level, means that inquiry is being quashed or at least limited. And then the anticipatory obedience of what people are doing, even if it's not related directly to that, I think that's a big problem. I think, though, that, just to put this in perspective a little bit, again, briefly, is that the EO, the executive order, was part of a suite of what a lot of people are seeing as an attack on science, an attack on, whether you want to call it an attack on inquiry or just an attack on research and researchers and their budgets and their work, that even if all of it gets rolled back, which seems unlikely, but even if all of it were to get rolled back, whether it's court order or they roll it back because it is no longer the most popular part of what he's doing, et cetera, it's causing such consternation and such, honestly, existential dread among scientists that they are leaving the field or deciding not to do something. That, to me, hard to measure, but pernicious and probably a bigger problem.
We're going to loop back to that issue and discuss it. It's a fascinating topic. I want to, before we move to that, I want to now to go backwards in time a little bit and frame some of these issues about the relationship of government funding to science for our listeners, so that when we do that we approach this particular question, we can have that background. And as I understand, the movement of government funding into research at universities is a relatively new phenomenon. In the 1940s, for example, my understanding is that most universities were reluctant to take funding from government on the research side because they wanted to have their own independence. I think academic freedom in those days was thought to be perhaps threatened by new funding sources from government, perhaps presciently, but it's a complicated issue as we'll be finding out. Can you just say a little bit about that? I mean, my understanding was that, and Vannevar Bush, I think, is really an important figure that you and I were talking about before we came on the show in this process. So, how did government start funding research in science, and what were some of the issues when that happened?
Yeah, so I'm going to, for 30 seconds, take us even further back and just sort of set the stage a little bit.
I love going back further. Stepping back is my favorite thing to do. So step back.
Just not off the cliff. Exactly. Just I'm glad we both went there. Maybe I'm disturbed we both went there. I think because and the reason I want to do this is a couple trend lines. Like, one trend line is how much money it actually costs to do research. And, we can talk about, and I think we will talk about, that there's fraud and there's various things, problems in that, inherent in any human endeavor. However, there's really no denying that it has become much, much, much more expensive to do research today than it was in, the 1940s when we're talking about Vannevar Bush, and I want to get back to that in a second. But let's go back 400 years or even 500 years. It cost, I don't want to say nothing, but like relatively nothing to do fundamental work. How much, investment did Isaac Newton need? Now, he needed some, but there were sort of patricians who could support basically what we needed. I'm oversimplifying here, and probably maybe even unfairly, but there's no question that the cost of research, it's buying lab equipment, it's buying reagents, it's like buying mice that transgenic mice that are bred to sort of have a certain disease or not have it, things like that are, or building telescopes, right? Probably you spend as much building a world-class telescope on top of a mountain now as maybe the entire budget of whatever year in the 1900s. So the reason I want to just push on that a little bit is that the money has to come from somewhere if you want science. Now, if we as a society or as a government, or hopefully a government that is reflecting the will of society at least, decide we don't need that and they can go do it however they want, that's a decision. It's one I vehemently disagree with. I think that science and research, when done well, which a lot of it is the best way, maybe the only good way to understand the world better. And therefore, whether you want to talk about applied knowledge and coming up with new, vaccines and drugs, or just knowing how stuff works, which is pretty damn important and fascinating, like there's no other way to do it other than to have funds for it. So if we can't, and there may be people who disagree with me on that and say not so much that it wouldn't cost money, but we shouldn't prioritize that. I respect that. Again, disagree with it. But if you therefore then sort of track that historically against the trend line of government involvement in funding, right? It tracks, because what was happening in the 1940s, right? It was a bit pre-Sputnik, right? So obviously, but
Manhattan
Project, exactly. There were needs that scientists, or at least that people felt scientists, and I would agree, were uniquely positioned to fill. So therefore, to fulfill. So therefore, you had a need for funding. Now, you had a need for structure, you had a need for all sorts of things, but you had a need for a workforce. And so it was not purely a competitive play at that time. It became one, right? So, you could have started the NIH or, sort of created what is now the NIH in the 1940s, and then nothing else really happened. Then it kind of went along. Well, now it's, you could argue, a behemoth. It's looking at give or take a $50 billion budget. And so one of the things that happened there was that not only did they say, well, we should fund, research grants, we should fund specific research, we should also fund what are known now as indirect costs, right? Overhead costs, the costs of, heating a building at a university, or of hiring administrative staff, or doing things that you need in order to actually manage this process, which is the sort of unsung heroes in many ways of what goes on. Over time, so Bush himself actually sort of, he was, I would put sort of emotions in his head, but he was actually a bit frustrated, maybe surprised, that universities at that time said, well, we don't really want that. Like, they were more open to the idea of funding, but the sort of indirect costs, like, we don't want our sort of core needs to be funded by government, because then the government will have too much control over it, which I think is fascinating, because that is an argument you hear a lot from, I would argue, the right.
Yes, of course.
You don't hear it much from the left.
It's most famous with Hillsdale College, who refused to take federal funding so that they could have autonomy in a whole variety of ways.
And you also see people say, well, the reason why climate change research sort of always seems to point in a particular direction is because of the need to seek funding from agencies like EPA or from NSF, and also NOAA, that sort of go a certain way, if you will. And I think, or at least have, and I think, but if you sort of couple that with, well, not couple it with, but if you then go through history again a little bit, I'll just do this somewhat briefly. Over time, that notion of indirect costs, which are being directly attacked right now by the Trump administration, this notion of indirect costs has swung pendulum-wise over time. Sometimes probably for good reason, other times in reaction to something bad that happened. So, for example, scandal in the really sort of late 80s, early 90s about it being, some of these funds being misused and sort of used on what they really shouldn't have been, or at least people didn't think they should be.
For example, the yacht.
For example, a yacht at Stanford University, so that they could attract big donors who also like yachts, right?
And
I like yachts. I've only been on a few, but.
And I was telling you before we came on that I was teaching at Stanford at the time when that whole scandal was breaking, and it was front page news in the in the local papers.
So things swung back, and then again, as you might expect, Congress and what have you said, well, that's terrible. We've got to pull these things back. They then crept back up, and then there were some other times when they also again shrunk. It's sort of a cycle, and then a couple years ago, and this is what people are pointing out as this. Sort of as these Trump comments and sort of orders start to come out, is that Congress, I think probably in anticipation of what might happen, essentially enshrined a certain overall rate of indirect costs, but also more importantly said it's an act of, it requires an act of Congress to change that. You can't just do that, next president, whoever he might be. Well, guess what? He's trying to do that. Again, all of this as by way of saying, funding for research, I would argue, is critical. And the problem is that if you say, well, we're not going to fund it, the government shouldn't fund it, or it should fund it less, someone else is probably going to come in and sweep in and actually replace that. And in the case of clinical medicine and clinical research, that's almost exclusively industry. So it's a bit of careful what you wish for, or harm reduction, if you want to think of it. In other words, there are a lot of people who object strenuously to industry funding research, and yet they're the only ones who can afford to do it in clinical trials. So if you're saying, let's remove all government funding, you're only going to have more of that. Or you're, I guess, going to get rid of science, which I hope not.